The morning sun barely touched the edges of London Heathrow Airport when James Mitchell walked through the automatic doors of Terminal 5. He wore simple clothes that day, a plain navy jacket over a white shirt and dark trousers. Nothing about his appearance screamed importance or demanded attention. His gray hair was neatly combed and his posture remained straight despite his 62 years. On his chest, almost hidden by his jacket, hung a small bronze cross with a crimson ribbon. Most people wouldn't recognize it, but those who knew understood its weight. It was the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Commonwealth, awarded for valor in the face of the enemy. James had served in the British Army for over 30 years. He had seen conflicts that most people only read about in newspapers. He had led men through impossible situations, made decisions that saved lives, and carried memories that sometimes kept him awake at night. But today he was just a passenger trying to catch a flight to Edinburgh for his daughter's wedding. His uniform stayed home in the closet. He wanted to travel quietly without fuss or recognition. The airport bustled with its usual chaos. Families dragged oversized suitcases. Business travelers hurried past with coffee cups in hand, and announcement speakers called out gate numbers and boarding times. James walked steadily toward the check-in counter, his small carry-on bag rolling smoothly behind him. He had learned long ago to pack light and travel efficiently. At the premium check-in desk stood a young woman named Rebecca Walsh. She was 28 years old and had worked for the airline for just over 2 years. Rebecca took pride in her position, perhaps too much pride. She had been promoted to the premium desk 6 months earlier, and the authority had gone to her head. She believed that checking documents and managing boarding passes gave her power over the passengers who stood before her. Her perfectly pressed uniform and carefully applied makeup completed the image she wanted to project. Someone important, someone in control. James approached her counter with a polite smile. He placed his ticket and passport on the desk and waited. Rebecca looked up from her computer screen, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. She saw an older man in simple clothes, someone she immediately assumed didn't belong at her premium counter. Her expression shifted from neutral to annoyed in seconds. She picked up his documents with obvious reluctance, as if touching them might somehow contaminate her manicured fingers. Her eyes barely glanced at the information before she looked back at James with barely concealed contempt. The other staff members nearby continued their work, unaware of what was beginning to unfold. James noticed her attitude but said nothing. He had faced far worse than a dismissive look from an airport employee. He simply waited patiently, his hands resting calmly at his sides. Years of military discipline had taught him patience even when facing disrespect. Rebecca's fingers flew across her keyboard, but her movements seemed deliberately slow. She was making him wait, establishing her authority over this ordinary-looking passenger. Finally she spoke, her voice dripping with condescension. She told him there was a problem with his booking. Her tone suggested that this problem was somehow his fault, that he had made some terrible mistake that she now had to fix. James remained calm. He explained that his booking had been confirmed weeks ago, and that he had received all the proper confirmation emails. His voice stayed level and respectful, never rising or showing frustration. He had learned long ago that shouting never solved problems, but Rebecca wasn't interested in his explanations. She interrupted him mid-sentence, her voice louder now, attracting attention from nearby passengers. She told him that premium passengers needed to meet certain standards. She emphasized the word standards as if it were a weapon, using it to cut him down. Her eyes again swept over his simple clothing, his worn but polished shoes, his plain jacket. Other passengers in the queue began to notice the confrontation. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the scene. Others watched with curiosity, wondering what this older gentleman had done to deserve such treatment. The whispers started, soft at first but growing louder. James felt their eyes on him but refused to show embarrassment. He had stood before enemy fire without flinching. He certainly wouldn't crumble under the stare of airport travelers. Rebecca continued her verbal assault. She suggested that perhaps he had made a mistake, that perhaps he had purchased the wrong ticket, that perhaps he didn't understand how premium travel worked. Each suggestion was an insult wrapped in professional language. She spoke to him as if he were a child who had wandered into the wrong section of the airport. James took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the Victoria Cross against his chest. hidden beneath his jacket. He thought about the men he had served with, some of whom never made it home. He thought about the values he had spent his life defending: Mao's dignity, respect, honor. And here he stood, being treated like a nuisance by someone who had likely never faced a truly difficult day in her life. He opened his mouth to respond, to calmly explain once more that his booking was correct, but Rebecca raised her hand to silence him. The gesture was dismissive, almost cruel. She turned to her computer screen, pointedly ignoring him while she typed something. The message was clear. She would deal with him when she was ready and not a moment sooner. The other airline staff members at nearby counters occasionally glanced over, but none intervened. This wasn't unusual behavior from Rebecca. She had developed a reputation for being difficult with passengers she deemed unworthy of premium service. Management had received complaints before, but she was efficient at her job when it came to the paperwork, so the complaints were often overlooked. James remained standing at the counter, his dignity intact despite the humiliation being heaped upon him. He thought about simply walking away, about going to another counter or even another airline. But his daughter's wedding was tomorrow morning. He needed to be on this flight, so he stood his ground, waiting for Rebecca to finish her performance of power. What neither James nor Rebecca knew was that in exactly 8 minutes, everything would change. In 8 minutes, the atmosphere of Terminal 5 would shift dramatically. In 8 minutes, Rebecca Walsh would learn a lesson about respect that she would never forget. But for now, in this moment, she continued typing on her keyboard, deliberately keeping an honored war hero waiting while other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence. Rebecca finally looked up from her computer screen after what felt like an eternity. Her expression showed no remorse for making James wait. Instead, she wore a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that people use when they know they have power over someone else. She informed James that his ticket had been downgraded to economy class. The words came out smoothly as if she had practiced them. James felt a flash of confusion cross his face. He asked her to explain how this could have happened. He had paid for premium economy specifically because the seats offered more legroom, which his old war injury required on longer flights. His left leg still carried shrapnel from an explosion in Afghanistan, though he never complained about it. The doctors had told him that staying in cramped positions for too long could cause significant pain. Rebecca shrugged, a gesture of complete indifference. She told him that these things happened sometimes, that the system had automatically downgraded him due to overbooking. Her tone suggested that she didn't care about his reasons for needing the better seat. She informed him that he could either accept the economy seat or miss his flight. The choice, she said with that same cold smile, was entirely his. James placed both hands on the counter, not in anger, but to steady himself. The pain in his leg was already starting to remind him of its presence. He spoke quietly but firmly, asking to speak with a supervisor. This wasn't about pride or status. This was about a legitimate need related to his service injury. He didn't mention the injury directly, not wanting to make excuses or seek sympathy, but he needed that seat. Rebecca's face hardened at his request. She viewed it as a challenge to her authority, an insult to her ability to handle the situation. Her voice rose several notches as she told him that she was perfectly capable of handling his problem, that bothering a supervisor wouldn't change anything. She added that if he continued to make difficulties, she could have him removed from the flight entirely. The queue behind James had grown longer. More passengers were watching now, some recording the confrontation on their phones. In today's world, every public disagreement became potential entertainment for social media. James noticed the phones but didn't care. He had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. He had simply asked for the seat he had paid for, nothing more. An older couple standing in line behind James exchanged worried glances. The husband, a retired teacher named Robert, leaned toward his wife and whispered that the airline employee was being completely unreasonable. He had served briefly in the military himself many years ago and recognized something in James's bearing, the way he stood, the quiet dignity he maintained. Robert suspected this wasn't just any ordinary passenger being mistreated. Rebecca picked up her phone and made a call. She spoke into it while maintaining eye contact with James, a power move designed to intimidate. She asked for security to come to her counter, claiming there was a difficult passenger causing a disturbance. James heard every word but still didn't react with anger. He simply stood there waiting, his face calm despite the injustice of the situation. Within 2 minutes, a security officer arrived. His name was David Chen, a 45-year-old former police officer who now worked airport security. David had dealt with countless passenger disputes over his 8 years at Heathrow. He approached the counter expecting to find an aggressive, unreasonable traveler. Instead, he found a dignified older man standing quietly, showing no signs of the disturbance Rebecca had described. David asked Rebecca to explain the situation. She immediately launched into a dramatic account of how James had been arguing with her, refusing to accept his ticket situation, making demands, and holding up the entire queue. She painted a picture of an entitled passenger who thought the rules didn't apply to him. Her performance was convincing and she knew it. James waited until she finished before calmly providing his version of events. He spoke clearly and concisely, explaining about his confirmed booking, the unexplained downgrade, and his simple request to speak with a supervisor. He didn't raise his voice or embellish the story. He stated facts, just as he had stated facts countless times in military debriefings throughout his career. David looked between the two of them, trying to assess the situation. His experience told him that Rebecca was probably exaggerating, but airport staff typically receive the benefit of the doubt in these situations. He asked James if he would be willing to accept the economy seat to resolve the matter quickly. His tone was respectful, at least more respectful than Rebecca's had been. James explained about his leg injury and the medical need for more space. He didn't mention his military service or the circumstances of the injury. He simply stated the medical fact how prolonged sitting in cramped conditions caused him significant pain. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was asking for what he had already purchased and what his physical condition required. Rebecca rolled her eyes at this explanation. She muttered something under her breath about passengers making up medical excuses. The comment was quiet, but not quiet enough. Both James and David heard it clearly. David shot her a warning look, but the damage was done. Her contempt for this passenger had been made crystal clear. Robert, the retired teacher still waiting in line, had heard enough. He stepped forward and addressed David directly. He told the security officer that he had witnessed the entire interaction and that the airline employee had been rude and dismissive from the very beginning. His wife nodded in agreement, adding that they had never seen such unprofessional behavior from airport staff. Other passengers began voicing their support for James. A businessman in an expensive suit mentioned that he had recorded part of the confrontation on his phone. A young woman traveling with her mother said she had also seen everything and would be happy to provide a statement. The tide was beginning to turn, but Rebecca seemed oblivious to how badly this situation was reflecting on her. David realized this was becoming more complicated than a simple passenger dispute. He asked James to step aside with him for a moment, away from Rebecca's counter. James agreed, grateful for the security officer's more reasonable approach. As they moved a few steps away, Rebecca called after them, reminding David that she wanted this difficult passenger dealt with properly. David and James stood near a large window overlooking the tarmac. David asked James directly if there was anything he could do to make this situation more comfortable. James appreciated the change in tone. He explained once more that he simply needed the seat he had booked and paid for. He showed David his booking confirmation on his phone, complete with the receipt for premium economy. David examined the information carefully. Everything appeared to be in order. There was no indication of any overbooking issue or system error. He looked back at Rebecca's counter, then at James, and a realization began to dawn on him. This might not be a system error at all. This might be a case of an employee abusing her small amount of power. Before David could speak again, a commotion near the entrance to the terminal caught his attention. Airport staff were suddenly standing straighter, adjusting their uniforms, speaking in urgent whispers to each other. Something important was happening, though neither David nor James yet understood what. Rebecca noticed the change in atmosphere too. She looked toward the terminal entrance, her expression shifting from smug satisfaction to uncertainty. Other passengers began turning their heads, trying to see what had caused the sudden shift in energy. The countdown to the most important 8 minutes of Rebecca Walsh's career was nearly complete. The whispers spread through Terminal 5 like wildfire. Passengers stopped mid-stride, their eyes turning toward the main entrance. Security personnel moved into position with practiced efficiency, creating a subtle but clear corridor through the crowd. Airport staff abandoned their casual postures and suddenly became models of professional attention. Something significant was about to happen, and everyone could feel it. James noticed the change but didn't understand its cause. His years in the military had made him observant of such shifts in atmosphere. Usually, they signaled danger or the arrival of someone important. In an airport, he assumed it was probably a dignitary or politician passing through. He had seen such movements before during his service. David, the security officer, received a message through his radio earpiece. His eyes widened slightly and he straightened his uniform jacket almost unconsciously. He glanced at James, then back toward the entrance, then at James again. An expression of concern crossed his face as if he had suddenly realized something important. Through the main entrance walked a group of men in dark suits, their eyes constantly scanning the environment. Close protection officers, James recognized immediately. He had worked alongside such men during his military career. They moved with purpose and awareness, their positions carefully coordinated to provide maximum coverage for whoever they were protecting. Behind them, walking with calm dignity, came King Charles III. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit with a light blue tie. His presence commanded attention without demanding it. He moved through the terminal not with the arrogance of assumed authority, but with the comfortable bearing of someone who had spent his entire life in the public eye. Several airport executives walked beside him, clearly honored by the royal visit but also nervous about ensuring everything went perfectly. The terminal seemed to hold its breath. Even the usual airport announcements seemed to pause, as if the very building itself recognized the importance of this moment. Travelers pulled out their phones, but the security team's presence made it clear that photographs would not be welcomed. This was an official visit, not a photo opportunity. Rebecca watched from her counter, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. She had been briefed that morning about a possible VIP visit to the terminal, but she had been told it would occur in the private executive lounge, far from the public areas. She certainly never expected to see the king walking through her section of the terminal. Her hands began to tremble slightly as she tried to look busy with her computer. King Charles was at Heathrow to officially open a new wing dedicated to supporting military veterans traveling through the airport. The initiative provided special services for former service members, including priority assistance, quiet rooms for those dealing with post-traumatic stress, and trained staff who understood the unique challenges veterans might face. It was a cause the king had personally championed, using his influence to ensure those who had served their country received proper recognition and support. As the royal party moved through the terminal, King Charles stopped occasionally to speak with airport staff and passengers. He had a genuine warmth in these interactions, asking questions and listening carefully to the answers. These weren't the mechanical exchanges of someone fulfilling an obligation. He seemed genuinely interested in the people he met. The group was heading toward the new Veterans Wing, which was located past the premium check-in area where James and Rebecca had their confrontation. The planned route would take King Charles directly past Rebecca's counter. The airport executives walking with him were explaining various aspects of the terminal's operations, pointing out features and discussing passenger flow. David, the security officer, suddenly understood the gravity of the situation developing before him. He looked at James with new eyes, noticing for the first time the small medal partially visible beneath his jacket. David had a brother who served in the Royal Marines, and he recognized the distinctive crimson ribbon of the Victoria Cross. His face went pale as he realized what had almost happened. What was still happening? He leaned toward James and quietly asked if that was indeed a Victoria Cross he was wearing. James nodded simply, not making a big deal of it. David's hands clenched at his sides as anger flashed across his face. Not anger at James, but anger at the situation, at how this decorated war hero had been treated, at how close this had come to becoming an international embarrassment for the airport. David quickly spoke into his radio, using codes that James didn't understand but recognized as urgent. He was trying to alert his supervisors about the situation before the king arrived at this section of the terminal. But the royal party was moving faster than expected, and there wasn't enough time for the message to climb the chain of command and result in any action. Rebecca saw the royal party approaching, and panic set in. She tried to appear busy and professional, hoping that she would simply blend into the background of airport staff. She avoided looking at James as if pretending he didn't exist might somehow erase the last 20 minutes of her behavior. She shuffled papers on her counter, typed randomly on her keyboard, and prayed that she would go unnoticed. But the universe has a way of ensuring that lessons are learned when they need to be. One of the airport executives walking with King Charles was the head of customer service, a woman named Margaret Harrison. She had received a notification on her phone just moments earlier about a passenger complaint and a potential social media incident developing in Terminal 5. The message mentioned video recordings and witnesses supporting a passenger's claim of mistreatment by Airline staff. Margaret's eyes scanned the area, looking for signs of trouble. She saw the small crowd still gathered near Rebecca's counter, saw the security officer standing with an older passenger, saw Rebecca looking decidedly uncomfortable. Margaret had worked in airport management for 25 years, and she could read a problematic situation from 100 meters away. This was definitely a problematic situation. She quietly excused herself from the royal party for a moment and approached her deputy, who was coordinating security from a nearby position. She asked him what was happening at the check-in counter. He quickly checked his tablet and reported that there had been a passenger dispute, that security had been called, and that the situation was supposedly being resolved. But he added that multiple witnesses had filed complaints supporting the passenger against the airline employee. Margaret made a quick decision. She returned to the royal party and quietly spoke to the king's private secretary, informing him of a situation that might require His Majesty's attention. She explained that a passenger, possibly a military veteran based on the witness reports, had been mistreated by airline staff. Given the nature of today's visit and the new veteran services being inaugurated, this seemed like something the king should be made aware of. The private secretary leaned toward King Charles and whispered briefly. The king's expression became serious and he nodded once. He asked to be taken to the situation immediately. The airport executives looked worried, unsure if this deviation from the planned schedule was wise, but nobody argued with the king's wishes. The royal party changed direction, heading directly toward Rebecca's counter. David saw them coming and gently touched James's elbow, trying to prepare him for what was about to happen. James looked up and saw the approaching group, saw the king at its center, and felt a complex mix of emotions. He wasn't seeking attention or special treatment. He just wanted to attend his daughter's wedding. But fate had other plans. Rebecca watched in horror as the royal party approached her counter. The last 8 minutes of her life replayed in her mind. Every dismissive word, every contemptuous look, every moment of petty cruelty suddenly seemed magnified 1,000 times. She wanted to disappear, to be anywhere else in the world, but she was frozen in place behind her counter, unable to escape what was coming. King Charles reached Rebecca's counter with his security team maintaining a respectful distance. The airport executives clustered nervously behind him, unsure how this unplanned interaction would unfold. Other passengers had pulled back, creating a natural circle of space around the counter. Everyone sensed that something important was about to happen, though most didn't understand exactly what. The king's eyes first found James, and something passed across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or at least an acknowledgement of something familiar. James stood at attention instinctively, decades of military training overriding his current civilian status. It was subtle, not a formal salute, but a straightening of his spine, a positioning of his shoulders that spoke of years of service. King Charles noticed the posture immediately. He had spent his entire life around military personnel, had served himself in the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, and had become the ceremonial head of the British Armed Forces upon taking the throne. He could recognize a soldier, even one in civilian clothes, from across a room. His gaze traveled down to James's chest, where the Victoria Cross hung partially visible beneath his jacket. The king's expression shifted to one of deep respect. He stepped forward, extending his hand toward James. The movement was so natural, so genuine, that it caught everyone off guard. This wasn't the formal handshake of a king greeting a subject. This was one person of honor greeting another. James took the offered hand, shaking it firmly but not presuming anything beyond this gesture of respect. Rebecca stood behind her counter, her face drained of all color. She gripped the edge of the desk to keep her hands from shaking visibly. Her mind raced through everything she had said and done in the past 20 minutes. Every word now seemed like a weapon she had foolishly turned upon herself. Margaret Harrison, the customer service executive, stood beside the king, her professional expression not quite hiding her anger at what she suspected had occurred here. King Charles spoke to James, his voice warm and genuinely interested. He asked if James was traveling today, and James confirmed that he was attempting to reach Edinburgh for his daughter's wedding. The king smiled at this, mentioning that weddings were joyous occasions that should never be missed. He asked if everything was going smoothly with James's travel arrangements. The question hung in the air like a challenge. James hesitated, not from fear but from consideration. He had never been one to complain or seek special treatment. His entire military career had been built on handling difficulties quietly and professionally. But something in the king's direct gaze, in the genuine concern evident in his expression, made evasion seem disrespectful. James spoke carefully, explaining that there had been a small difficulty with his booking, that his premium economy seat had been unexpectedly downgraded, and that he was working with security to resolve the matter. He didn't mention Rebecca's behavior or the way he had been treated. He stated only the facts, leaving emotion and accusation out of his words entirely. But David, the security officer, had no such reluctance. He had been silent until now, but the presence of the king and the potential embarrassment to the airport overcame his usual professional restraint. He stepped forward and respectfully addressed King Charles, explaining that the situation was more serious than James was indicating. He mentioned that there had been complaints from multiple witnesses about the treatment this passenger had received from airline staff. Rebecca felt the world closing in around her. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain that this had all been a misunderstanding, but no words would come. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water. The confident, dismissive woman from 20 minutes ago had completely disappeared, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. Margaret Harrison stepped forward and addressed James directly, apologizing on behalf of the airport and asking if he would be willing to explain what had happened. Her tone made it clear this wasn't optional. This was going to be investigated thoroughly, and she needed to understand the situation immediately, especially with the king standing there as a witness to whatever had occurred. James reluctantly recounted the events. He described arriving at the counter, presenting his valid tickets and documentation, and being told his seat had been downgraded. He mentioned requesting to speak with a supervisor and being refused. He talked about the security being called, though he emphasized that David had been professional and helpful. Throughout his account, James never raised his voice or used harsh words to describe Rebecca's behavior. He simply stated what had occurred, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Robert, the retired teacher who had been waiting in line, couldn't stay silent any longer. He interrupted, respectfully addressing King Charles and explaining that he had witnessed everything. He described Rebecca's dismissive attitude, her contemptuous treatment of James, her eye-rolling and condescending comments. His wife nodded vigorously beside him, adding that it had been painful to watch such disrespect shown to an older gentleman who had been nothing but polite. Other passengers began adding their voices. The businessman with the expensive suit held up his phone, mentioning that he had recorded part of the confrontation. The young woman with her mother described how uncomfortable it had made everyone in the queue feel. One by one, the witnesses came forward, each account painting a clearer picture of what had occurred at this counter. King Charles listened to each person with full attention, his expression growing more serious with each testimony. When the witnesses finished speaking, he turned his gaze to Rebecca. The look wasn't angry exactly, but it carried a weight that made her want to sink through the floor. He asked her directly if what these people were saying was accurate. Rebecca's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. She tried to explain that there had been a system error, that she was just following procedures, that things had gotten out of hand. But even she could hear how weak her explanation sounded. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and standing before the king himself lying seemed impossible. The king let her struggle through her attempted justifications without interrupting. When she finally fell silent, he asked her a simple question. Did she know what the medal on James's chest represented? Rebecca looked at the Victoria Cross for the first time, really looked at it, and understanding began to dawn on her face. She shook her head slowly, admitting that she didn't know. King Charles explained, his voice carrying clearly through the silent terminal, that the Victoria Cross was awarded for the most extreme bravery in the face of the enemy. He described how fewer than 1,500 had been awarded since its creation in 1856, how each recipient had performed acts of valor that most people couldn't even imagine. He explained that the man standing before them had earned that medal through courage and sacrifice, had served his country with distinction, and deserved to be treated with the utmost respect, not just because of his service, but because every human being deserved such treatment. The king's words weren't shouted. He didn't need to raise his voice. The quiet intensity of his delivery was far more effective than any amount of yelling could have been. Every person in that section of the terminal heard him clearly, and many would remember his words for the rest of their lives. Rebecca's face crumbled. Tears began streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of her actions crashed down upon her. She had belittled a war hero, treated him like he was worthless, exercised her tiny amount of power to make his life difficult, and done it all while he remained dignified and respectful. And now, standing before the king, before witnesses, before the judgment of everyone around her, she finally understood what she had done. Margaret Harrison's expression was stone. She informed Rebecca that she was suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. Security would escort her from the terminal, and human resources would be contacting her. Rebecca nodded numbly, unable to form words, unable to do anything but accept the consequences of her actions. But King Charles wasn't finished. He turned back to James and asked about his daughter's wedding. James explained that it was tomorrow morning in Edinburgh, that his daughter was marrying a young man she had met at university, that he was supposed to walk her down the aisle. The king listened with genuine interest, asking about the couple and the wedding plans. King Charles turned to Margaret Harrison, and the other airport executives gathered around. His voice remained calm but carried an unmistakable tone of command. He stated that this situation needed to be resolved immediately and properly. A decorated veteran traveling to his daughter's wedding should not be subjected to such treatment, and the airport had a responsibility to make this right. Margaret nodded vigorously, already pulling out her phone to make calls. She assured the king that she would personally handle the situation and ensure James reached Edinburgh comfortably and on time. Her fingers flew across her phone screen, sending urgent messages to various departments. This was no longer just a customer service issue. This had become a matter of institutional reputation with the king himself as a witness. King Charles asked James directly what would make this situation right. James, still uncomfortable with the attention, simply requested his original seat back so he could travel as planned. He didn't ask for upgrades or compensation. He just wanted what he had paid for, nothing more. The simplicity of his request, the lack of demand for anything beyond basic fairness, made an impression on everyone listening. The king shook his head gently, a slight smile crossing his face. He mentioned that while James's humility was admirable, perhaps the airport might consider doing slightly better than simply returning him to his original booking. He looked meaningfully at Margaret, who immediately understood the subtle but clear instruction she was receiving. Margaret made several more phone calls, her voice becoming increasingly urgent with each conversation. Within minutes, she announced that James would be upgraded to first class on the next flight to Edinburgh, which departed in 90 minutes. The airline would also be refunding his original ticket price in full and providing a formal written apology. Additionally, ground transportation would be arranged at both ends of the journey, ensuring he arrived at his daughter's home without any further complications. James began to protest, saying this was far too much, that he didn't need such special treatment. But King Charles placed a hand gently on his shoulder and insisted that it wasn't special treatment. It was the appropriate treatment for someone who had given so much in service to the country. The king's words carried a finality that made further protests seem inappropriate. The airport's VIP lounge manager appeared, slightly out of breath from rushing to the scene. Margaret instructed him to escort James to the first-class lounge immediately, to ensure he had everything he needed while waiting for his flight. The manager, a professional named Thomas who had worked at Heathrow for 15 years, recognized the seriousness of the situation and assured James he would be personally looked after. But before James left with Thomas, King Charles asked if he might have a private word. The two men stepped slightly away from the crowd, though security maintained a discreet watch. The king asked James about his service, about where he had served, about the circumstances that had led to his Victoria Cross. James, who normally never discussed such things, found himself answering the king's questions. There was something about the genuine interest, the respectful attention, that made the conversation feel natural rather than forced. James explained that he had served in Afghanistan, that his unit had been ambushed during a routine patrol, that several of his men had been wounded in the initial attack. He had carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire, then returned to retrieve a 4th man who had been pinned down. The enemy fire had been intense, and he had been wounded himself, but he had refused to leave anyone behind. The shrapnel in his leg was a permanent reminder of that day, though he considered himself fortunate compared to others who had sacrificed far more. King Charles listened with the attention of someone who understood the weight of such stories. He had heard many similar accounts over the years, had presented medals to brave men and women, had visited wounded soldiers in hospitals. But each story remained unique, each sacrifice deserving of individual recognition. He thanked James for his service, and the words carried genuine emotion, not the hollow politeness of a ceremonial phrase. The king then mentioned the new Veterans Wing he was inaugurating that day, explaining its purpose and the services it would provide. He expressed hope that facilities like this would help make travel easier for former service members, especially those dealing with injuries or psychological challenges from their time in uniform. He asked James if he thought such services would be helpful, genuinely interested in the perspective of someone who had actually served. James agreed that such facilities were valuable, especially for younger veterans who might be struggling with the transition back to civilian life. He mentioned that many of his former comrades had difficulty with crowds and noise after their service, that airports could be particularly challenging environments for those dealing with post-traumatic stress. The conversation between them was thoughtful and substantive, 2 people discussing a serious issue rather than engaging in superficial pleasantries. Meanwhile, Rebecca was being escorted from the terminal by security. She walked in a daze, her career likely over, her reputation destroyed. Other airline staff watched her leave with mixed expressions. Some felt sympathy, recognizing that she had made a terrible mistake but was still a human being. Others felt she had gotten exactly what she deserved, that her consistent pattern of rudeness and power tripping had finally caught up with her. David, the security officer who had initially responded to Rebecca's call, approached Margaret Harrison. He apologized for not intervening sooner, for not recognizing the severity of the situation immediately. Margaret assured him that he had handled things appropriately once he understood what was happening. She noted that his quick thinking in alerting supervisors had helped prevent an even worse situation from developing. The passengers who had witnessed the entire event were buzzing with excitement. Many were already posting about it on social media, though airport security was ensuring that no photos of the king or James were shared without permission. The story would spread regardless. By evening, news outlets would be reporting on the incident, though the details would vary wildly depending on the source. Robert, the retired teacher, approached Thomas and asked if he could pass along his contact information to James. He wanted to send a proper letter of apology on behalf of everyone who had witnessed the mistreatment without initially speaking up. Thomas promised to convey the message, touched by the older man's sense of responsibility. King Charles concluded his conversation with James and returned to the waiting group of executives and security personnel. He instructed Margaret to provide him with a full report on the incident within 24 hours, including details on how the situation had been allowed to develop and what steps would be taken to prevent similar occurrences. His tone made clear this wasn't a suggestion but a royal directive. Margaret assured him that a comprehensive investigation would be conducted, that all staff would receive additional training on treating passengers with respect, and that the airline's booking procedures would be reviewed to understand how a confirmed premium economy seat could be downgraded without proper explanation or alternative arrangements. The king then did something unexpected. He asked if the other passengers who had been waiting in Rebecca's queue had been taken care of, if their travel plans had been disrupted by the incident. Margaret quickly dispatched staff members to check with each person to ensure that anyone who had been delayed received appropriate compensation and assistance. The king's attention to these details, his concern for everyone affected by the situation, impressed even the most cynical airport employees present. Thomas gently reminded James that the first-class lounge was ready for him whenever he wished to go. James took one final look at the scene around him, at the king surrounded by officials, at the other passengers still watching, at the place where he had stood 20 minutes earlier being treated like he was worthless. The contrast was almost surreal. As Thomas led James toward the first-class lounge, King Charles called after him one more time. When James turned back, the king smiled warmly and wished him joy at his daughter's wedding, adding that she must be very proud to have such a father. James felt emotion tighten his throat, unable to speak for a moment. He simply nodded his thanks and continued walking, leaving behind a scene that would be discussed and analyzed for weeks to come. The first-class lounge was a world away from the chaos of the terminal. Soft lighting, comfortable leather chairs, and attentive staff created an atmosphere of calm luxury. Thomas personally escorted James to a quiet corner with a view of the tarmac, where planes taxied and departed in their endless dance. He asked what James would like to eat or drink, mentioning that anything available was complimentary. James requested a simple cup of tea and perhaps a sandwich if it wasn't too much trouble. Thomas smiled and assured him that nothing was too much trouble, especially not today. Within minutes, a staff member arrived with a pot of tea, a selection of sandwiches, fresh fruit, and several pastries. James tried to explain that he only needed a little, but the staff member insisted it was all prepared specifically for him. As James sat in the comfortable chair, sipping his tea and looking out at the aircraft, the events of the past hour began to settle in his mind. He thought about how quickly things could change, how a moment of cruelty could be exposed and corrected, and how justice, though sometimes delayed, could still arrive when least expected. His phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter. She was asking if everything was all right with his flight, if he would arrive on time. James smiled and typed a response, assuring her that everything was fine, better than fine actually, and that he would definitely be there to walk her down the aisle tomorrow. He didn't mention what had happened. That story could wait for another day, perhaps years from now when they could laugh about it together. Back in the terminal, King Charles completed his tour of the new Veterans Wing. The facility was impressive, featuring quiet rooms for those who needed to escape the sensory overload of the busy airport, trained counselors available for anyone struggling with stress or anxiety, and priority assistance for veterans with disabilities. The king met with several veterans who were using the facility, listening to their stories and thanking them for their service. During a brief press conference about the new facility, a reporter asked if the king had encountered any veterans during his tour today. King Charles paused, choosing his words carefully. He mentioned meeting a decorated war hero who exemplified the best qualities of military service: stoic, courage, dignity, and humility. He didn't provide names or specific details respecting James's privacy, but he emphasized the importance of treating all veterans with the respect they deserved. The reporter, sensing a larger story, pressed for more information. But the king's private secretary smoothly intervened, redirecting questions back to the new veteran services. The full story of what had happened with Rebecca and James would eventually emerge through social media and witness accounts. But for now, the king maintained discretion. Margaret Harrison spent the rest of the day managing the fallout from the incident. She personally called the airline's chief executive to explain what had happened and what steps were being taken. The executive was horrified, not just because of the king's involvement, but because of the fundamental failure of customer service the incident represented. He authorized Margaret to take whatever actions necessary to address the situation. Rebecca sat in her small flat that evening, still in shock from the day's events. She had received an official letter of suspension via email, informing her that a disciplinary hearing would be scheduled within the week. She knew her career with the airline was likely over, but more than losing her job, she felt the weight of her actions in a way she never had before. She thought about James, about his quiet dignity, about how he had never raised his voice or been rude despite her terrible treatment of him. She thought about the Victoria Cross hanging from his chest, about what it meant, about the courage and sacrifice it represented. She had treated a hero like he was nobody, and she had done it because she could, because she had a tiny bit of power and had chosen to abuse it. Rebecca opened her laptop and began writing. Not an excuse or a justification, but a genuine apology. She knew it could never undo what she had done, but she needed to write it anyway. She addressed it to James, though she didn't know if it would ever reach him. She apologized for her behavior, acknowledged that there was no excuse for how she had treated him, and expressed hope that he had made it to his daughter's wedding, despite her attempts to make his day difficult. She also wrote about what she had learned, about how quickly privilege and power could corrupt even small actions, about how easy it was to forget that every person deserved respect, regardless of how they looked or what they wore. She promised herself that if she ever worked in customer service again, she would remember this day, would remember the shame and the lesson that came with it. James's flight to Edinburgh departed on time. The first-class cabin was nearly empty, and the flight attendants treated him with genuine warmth. They had been briefed about what happened, though not all the details, and they were determined to ensure his journey was as comfortable as possible. During the flight, James dozed occasionally, his legs stretched out in the spacious seat, the pain that had been building earlier finally easing. When the plane landed in Edinburgh, Thomas had arranged for a car to meet James at the gate. The driver was a veteran himself, retired from the Royal Air Force, and the two men chatted easily about service and sacrifice during the drive to James's daughter's home. The driver refused to accept any tip, saying it was an honor to drive someone wearing the Victoria Cross. James arrived at his daughter's house just as evening was settling in. She rushed out to greet him, throwing her arms around him with the enthusiasm of a child despite being a grown woman about to be married. She asked about his journey, and he simply said it had been interesting, promising to tell her the full story someday when they had more time. That night, as James lay in the guest room of his daughter's home, he thought about the events of the day. He didn't feel vindicated or victorious. He felt tired and grateful. Tired from the journey and the drama, grateful that he had made it in time for the wedding. The confrontation with Rebecca seemed like something from a different lifetime already. A brief moment of difficulty in a long life that had contained far greater challenges. The next morning, James woke early and put on his formal suit. He pinned the Victoria Cross to his chest, as he always did for important occasions. When his daughter saw him dressed and ready, tears formed in her eyes. She told him he looked distinguished, that she was so proud to have him walk her down the aisle. He hugged her carefully, mindful of her wedding dress, and told her that she was the one who made him proud every single day. The wedding was beautiful. The small church was filled with flowers and sunlight. James walked his daughter down the aisle with steady steps, ignoring the slight pain in his leg, focused entirely on the joy of the moment. When they reached the altar and the minister asked who gave this woman to be married, James answered clearly, his voice strong with emotion and love. During the reception, someone showed James a news article on their phone. The story about the airport incident had spread online, with various versions being reported by different outlets. Some focused on Rebecca's behavior, others on the king's intervention, and a few on James's quiet dignity throughout the ordeal. James read it briefly and handed the phone back, more interested in celebrating his daughter's happiness than dwelling on what had happened. One of the wedding guests, an older gentleman who had served in the military himself, approached James later in the evening. He said he had heard about the airport incident and wanted James to know that his behavior had reminded people what true strength looked like. James thanked him but deflected the praise, saying he had simply tried to handle a difficult situation as best he could. As the evening wound down and the celebration continued around him, James found a quiet moment to reflect. He thought about respect and dignity, about how easily they could be given or withheld, about how positions of power revealed character rather than creating it. He thought about Rebecca and hoped she would learn from this experience, that she would become a better person because of it, rather than simply a more bitter one. The story of that day at Heathrow Airport would be retold many times in the months and years that followed. It would appear in training materials for customer service employees, in articles about treating veterans with respect, in discussions about abuse of authority. The specifics would sometimes be exaggerated or changed, but the core message remained constant. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they appear, and cruelty often reveals more about the person inflicting it than the person receiving it. For James, however, the incident became just another story in a long life full of them. He returned to London after the wedding. went back to his quiet routine, and rarely mentioned what had happened unless directly asked. The Victoria Cross remained on his chest during formal occasions, a reminder not of glory but of responsibility, sacrifice, and the brothers he had served alongside. And sometimes, when he traveled through airports in the years that followed, he would notice airline staff treating passengers with extra care and attention. He liked to think that maybe in some small way, that difficult day at Heathrow had made things a little better for others. Not because of anything he had done, but because sometimes the world needs to be reminded that